You are more dangerous to this country than Maoist terrorists, than Maoist terrorists.
Freedom, freedom.
If you want to have a healthy democracy, you ought to have people get the best information possible. There has to be a difference of opinion. That difference of opinion has to come out, and it's only in that clash and debate that the truth will emerge.
Give me freedom.
When you compare the laws that existed on the statute books in the colonial period with those that exist today after independence, I would say that we are certainly better off in some ways today than what we were back then. But the changes that took place in the laws relating to free speech were incremental changes, not changes that came about drastically or in a revolutionary manner with the enactment of the Constitution. And in some ways, we're not necessarily better off today than what we were in the British era, the most prominent example being sedition, which today is a cognizable offence, which it wasn't in the British era. Think about this. When Tilak was accused of committing sedition in the colonial period, a police officer, a white police officer employed by the colonial state, could not arrest Tilak without first obtaining a warrant from a magistrate. Whereas today in independent India, a man like Kanhaiya Kumar can be arrested by a police officer without obtaining a warrant from a magistrate. There was a very interesting case involving a lady called Shaila Bala Devi in Patna. This was a case again involving press censorship. And one of the judges of the Patna High Court, a man by the name of Justice Sarju Prasad, concluded his judgment with a very chilling observation. He said that the new right to free speech under the Constitution allows a person to preach murder and other cognizable offences with impunity. So according to Justice Sarju Prasad, if I encourage you in my newspaper to commit murder and to commit other cognizable offences under the Indian Penal Code, that was perfectly allowed under Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution. This single passage of Justice Sarju Prasad sent a chill down the spine of many parliamentarians and was almost single-handedly responsible for the First Amendment, which introduced many exceptions to the right to free speech. What's interesting is that while the First Amendment to the US Constitution gave American citizens the right to free speech, the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution, enacted in June 1951, restricted the right of free speech of many Indians, because what it did was it introduced 2 or 3 exceptions, some more exceptions under Article 19(2), most notably the exception dealing with public order. There's a well-known scholar by the name of Audrey Trushke, and she's visiting India, and she was supposed to be in Hyderabad for a talk. And she's known for her views about Aurangzeb. She's written a contrarian history of Aurangzeb and tried to say that Aurangzeb was a ruler who was not as anti-Hindu as he's made out to be. The police in Hyderabad said that she shouldn't come to Hyderabad and her event was cancelled. And I think that this really amounts to surrender to the mob. It's referred to in law as the heckler's veto. And all of the judgments of the Supreme Court, including judgments written by the great Justice Krishna Iyer, have said that we can't allow mobs and obdurate people and unreasonable people to decide what can and can't be said in public. Otherwise, this would amount to surrender to blackmail and surrender to intimidation. So what is a heckler's veto? Imagine that you're a stand-up comic and I don't like what you're saying. I heckle you. I interrupt you. I say, hey, don't talk about this. Don't crack this kind of a joke. If the comedian then decides to censor himself, then I win. I as the heckler get to decide what the comedian will or won't say. And that means that I as the heckler have got a veto. Now imagine there's a mob, and the mob doesn't like an intellectual or a historian or a scholar to say that Aurangzeb was a king who was pro-Hindu. Now all the mob has to do is threaten violence. All that the mob has to do is say that if Audrey Trushke or if any other scholar comes here and makes this sort of a statement, we'll combust into spontaneous violence. Well, this gives unreasonable people the right to decide what can and can't be said in public, and this absolutely should not be allowed. And in fact, there are many judgments of our Supreme Court which have said that this sort of practice is absolutely pernicious and not permitted. A system that allows, a legal regime that allows people to speak freely helps people achieve self-fulfillment. So think about an artist. an artist who paints a painting, M.F. Hussain for example. Now an artist is not, while painting a picture, an artist is not making a political point necessarily, but he is achieving self-fulfillment, a form of self-expression, so that in itself is valuable. The second is that laws that promote freedom of speech are laws that encourage the attainment of and discovery of truth and scientific knowledge. So think about it for a moment. It's because of laws that allow you to speak freely that a scientist can now challenge what the conventional narrative is. So a person could say back in the day that the world is round instead of flat, or that human beings evolved from an ape instead of being created by God. The third reason really is the most common one, which is that in any democracy, if you want to have a healthy democracy, you ought to have people get the best information possible. There has to be a difference of opinion. That difference of opinion has to come out, and it's only in that clash and debate that the truth will emerge. The freedom of speech, of course, can never be absolute. In the US, the First Amendment is drafted in a way which seems to suggest that it's absolute, but even in the US, freedom of speech is not absolute. For example, child pornography is not allowed there. The famous words uttered by an American judge, Oliver Wendell Holmes, in a case where he said that the most stringent protection of free speech will not allow a man to falsely shout fire in a crowded theatre. When a person's words are equatable to shouting fire in a crowded theatre, knowing that there is no fire, then of course that should be restricted. But when you can reason with a person, when you can debate with a person, then I believe that person's speech should be allowed. This in fact is a test which has recently been accepted by Justice Nariman in Shreya Singhal's case, where Justice Nariman said that there's a distinction between advocacy and incitement. So advocacy of a viewpoint, even if it's vehement, even if it's caustic, even if it's sharp and harsh, should be allowed. The moment a person starts inciting the commission of an offense, that's when it becomes something that shouldn't be allowed. So this test of advocacy and incitement, I think, is a very important one.